The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Copper Ridge in the summer of 1885, where Sarah McKenna stood defiantly on the wooden porch of her father's general store, her emerald eyes blazing with a fire that matched the desert heat that had been building since dawn. The 22-year-old woman had just shocked the entire town with words that would echo through the canyons and mesas for generations to come, her voice carrying across the main thoroughfare like the crack of a bullwhip in the still morning air. "I want him, do you hear me?" she had cried out to her father, Sheriff McKenna, and the gathered townspeople who had assembled like vultures drawn to carrion, their faces a mixture of scandal and morbid curiosity. Laugh if you wish, but he's the only one who made me feel alive. The declaration hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, acrid and dangerous, while the assembled crowd of merchants, ranchers, and their wives stood frozen in various states of shock and disapproval. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, clutched her pearl necklace as if it were a lifeline, her mouth agape, in a perfect circle of horror. Old Pete from the livery stable removed his weathered hat and scratched his graying head, muttering something about young folks these days, having no respect for proper behavior. "Rah! Ho 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 ho! Give me a reason to be a fool." It was a testing man, stepping through the air. In one bang of dynamite, Pete was falling from the weathered stable and was embedded in a coil hat, curled above a gray brow and perfectly untangled. Old Pete from the livery stable removed his weathered hat and scratched his graying head, muttering something about young folks these days, having no respect for proper behavior. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, clutched her pearl necklace as if it were a lifeline, her mouth agape in a perfect circle of horror. Upon Pete's reaction, Mrs. Henderson bent her weathered hat and scratched his graying. The man Sarah spoke of with such passionate conviction was none other than Jake Thornfield, a mysterious drifter with steel-gray eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of 1,000 sunsets, and a reputation that preceded him like thunder rolling across the vast expanse of the territorial plains. He had ridden into Copper Ridge exactly 3 weeks, 2 days, and 14 hours prior, though Sarah had been counting every moment since his arrival with the precision of a woman whose heart had suddenly discovered its true purpose. His black stallion had kicked up clouds of red dust that seemed to glow like embers in the afternoon light. The animal's powerful muscles rippling beneath its midnight coat as it carried its enigmatic rider down Main Street with the measured pace of a funeral procession or a royal parade. Jake's Winchester rifle lay across his saddle with the casual familiarity of a man who had learned that survival often depended on being prepared for trouble before it announced its intentions, and the leather holster at his hip bore the worn smoothness that spoke of countless draws and the hard-won wisdom that came from living on the razor's edge between civilization and chaos. Sarah's declaration sent shockwaves through the conservative frontier community like a stone thrown into a still pond, the ripples of scandal spreading outward to touch every corner of their small world, where proper ladies were expected to marry respectable ranchers with established spreads or successful merchants with growing businesses, not dangerous men with bounties on their heads and shadows in their past that seemed to follow them like loyal hounds. But Sarah McKenna had never been one to follow convention, a trait that had caused her father no small amount of worry. and her mother, God rest her soul, countless sleepless nights before consumption had claimed her 5 years prior. From the moment she first laid eyes on Jake Thornfield, Sarah knew with the absolute certainty of a desert storm that her life would never be the same, that the careful plans her father had made for her future had just been scattered to the four winds like tumbleweeds in a hurricane. Before we continue with Sarah's incredible journey of love and courage that would challenge everything this frontier town believed about proper behavior and the roles of women in their harsh but beautiful world, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we bring these forgotten tales of the American West to life. Now, let's dive deeper into this tale of forbidden love in the unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory, where the line between civilization and wilderness was as thin as morning frost and twice as fragile. The story of Sarah and Jake began on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other in the small but growing town of Copper Ridge, with the sun rising over the distant mountains like a ball of molten copper, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber that would have taken an artist's breath away. Sarah had been sweeping the front steps of McKenna's General Store, a morning ritual that she had performed countless times since her mother's death had left her to manage the domestic responsibilities of their household, while her father focused on his dual roles as sheriff and businessman. The rhythmic sound of the corn broom against the weathered wooden planks had become a meditation of sorts, a way to center herself before facing another day of measuring out flour and sugar, listening to the town gossips discuss their neighbor's business, and pretending to be interested in the increasingly persistent courtship attempts of Harold Pemberton, the banker's son, whose idea of romance involved lengthy discussions about interest rates and property values. It was while she was bent over, gathering the accumulated dust and debris into a neat pile, that she first heard the distinctive sound of hoofbeats approaching at a measured, unhurried pace that spoke of a rider who was either supremely confident or completely unaware of the potential dangers that lurked in the spaces between settlements. Sarah straightened slowly, one hand shading her eyes against the brilliant morning sun, and looked up to see a figure that seemed to emerge from the very legends and tall tales that were told around campfires and in saloons throughout the territory. Jake Thornfield sat tall in his saddle with the natural grace of a man who had spent more years on horseback than on foot, his weathered leather coat bearing the dust and wear of countless miles of hard travel across some of the most unforgiving terrain that God had ever created. The coat, once a rich brown, had faded to the color of old whiskey, and it hung on his lean frame with the comfortable familiarity of a second skin. His dark hair, the color of rich coffee beans, was slightly tousled by the desert wind that seemed to blow constantly across the open spaces, carrying with it the sense of sage and creosote and the promise of storms that might or might not come. There was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of both danger and nobility, like a fallen knight seeking redemption in the lawless territories of the frontier, or perhaps a prince in exile who had learned to find honor in the most unlikely places. His eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the distant mountains, surveyed the town with the careful attention of a man who had learned through bitter experience to read trouble in the set of a stranger's shoulders, or the way a hand rested too close to a gun butt. Those eyes missed nothing as they took in the layout of the streets the positions of the buildings, the faces of the people who had stopped their morning activities to stare at the newcomer with the mixture of curiosity and wariness that frontier towns reserved for strangers who rode in alone and unannounced. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as their gazes met for the first time across the dusty expanse of Main Street. And in that moment, she understood with crystal clarity what the poets meant when they wrote about lightning striking twice in the same place, about the earth moving beneath one's feet, about all the flowery metaphors that she had always dismissed as romantic nonsense, designed to sell books to lonely women with too much time on their hands. The weeks that followed Jake's arrival were filled with stolen glances and whispered conversations that set Sarah's heart racing like a wild Mustang across the open plains, each encounter leaving her more breathless and confused than the last. Despite her father's stern warnings delivered in the privacy of their small parlor behind the store, and the increasingly disapproving looks from the town's matrons who seemed to have appointed themselves as guardians of public morality, Sarah found herself drawn to the mysterious stranger like a moth to flame, helpless to resist the pull of something she couldn't name, but recognized in the deepest part of her soul. She would invent elaborate excuses to walk past the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Jake often sat nursing a whiskey at a corner table, his keen eyes watching the comings and goings of the townspeople with the wariness of a man who had learned that trust was a luxury he could rarely afford, and survival often depended on knowing who was friend and who was foe before they declared their intentions. The saloon, with its bat-wing doors and the constant sound of piano music drifting out into the street, had always been forbidden territory for respectable women. But Sarah found ways to pass by during her daily errands, her heart hammering against her ribs whenever she caught a glimpse of Jake's profile through the dusty windows. He seemed to sense her presence, even when she tried to be subtle. And more than once she caught him watching her, with an expression that was equal parts amusement and something deeper, something that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul, and found what he saw there worthy of his attention. Their first real conversation happened on a moonlit evening, when Sarah was returning from delivering supplies to the widow Henderson, who lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a weekly act of charity that her mother had begun and Sarah had continued out of both duty and genuine affection for the elderly woman, who had no family left to care for her. The path between the Henderson cabin and town proper was well-traveled during daylight hours, but after sunset it became a different creature entirely, full of shadows and sounds that can belong to anything, from a harmless jackrabbit to something considerably more dangerous. Sarah had made this walk countless times and knew every rock and rut in the road, but on this particular evening, something felt different, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Jake appeared from the shadows near the old oak tree that marked the halfway point between civilization and the wild frontier, his presence both startling and somehow expected, as if her subconscious had been anticipating this encounter, even while her rational mind focused on the simple task of putting one foot in front of the other. "Evening, Miss McKenna," he said, his voice carrying the rough warmth of aged bourbon and campfire smoke, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of places far from Arizona, perhaps Texas or Louisiana, somewhere where the air was thick with humidity and history. It's not safe for a lady to be walking alone after dark in these parts. There's been talk of Apache raiding parties moving through the territory. And even if that's just talk, there are other dangers that don't wear war paint. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. But she lifted her chin with the stubborn pride that had been her trademark since childhood. The same pride that had gotten her into trouble with school teachers and Sunday school instructors who expected young ladies to be seen and not heard. I've been walking these roads since I was old enough to carry a basket, Mr. Thornfield, she replied, though her voice betrayed the effect his presence had on her, coming out slightly breathless despite her best efforts to sound composed and unaffected. I reckon I can take care of myself just fine. Thank you very much. Jake's lips curved into a smile that was equal parts admiration and concern, and he fell into step beside her without invitation, his spurs jingling softly with each step in a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of her heart. I don't doubt that for a second, Miss McKenna, he said, his tone respectful but tinged with something that might have been amusement. But even the strongest wildflower needs protection from the storms that blow through the desert. And there are some storms that can uproot even the deepest foundations if they catch you unprepared. As they walked together through the silver-washed landscape, with the moon casting everything in shades of pearl and shadow, Sarah found herself opening up to this enigmatic man in ways she had never done with anyone before, not even her closest friend Mary Catherine, who had married a rancher from Tucson and moved away the previous spring. She told him about her dreams of seeing the world beyond Copper Ridge, of experiencing adventures that existed beyond the confines of her father's expectations and the town's narrow-minded conventions that seemed designed to keep everyone in their proper place, regardless of their personal desires or ambitions. She spoke of her longing to travel to places she had only read about in books, to see the ocean that stretched beyond the horizon like an endless blue promise, to walk through cities where buildings reach toward the sky like man-made mountains and people from a dozen different countries mingled in the streets, speaking languages that sounded like music to her untrained ear. Jake listened with an intensity that made her feel as though her words were precious gems being carefully examined and treasured, his gray eyes never leaving her face as she spoke, and she could see in his expression that he understood the restlessness that drove her, the feeling of being trapped in a life that was too small for the dreams that lived inside her heart. In return, he shared glimpses of his own story, speaking in carefully measured phrases about distant places and hard-won lessons, about the weight of choices that could never be undone and the price of living outside society's rules. He told her about mountains that touched the clouds and rivers that ran silvered in the moonlight, about cities where a man could disappear entirely and start fresh with a new name and a clean slate, about the freedom that came with having nothing to lose, and the loneliness that was the inevitable companion of such freedom. There was a poetry in his words that spoke to something deep within Sarah's soul, a recognition of kindred spirits who understood that some hearts were simply too wild to be tamed by conventional expectations, too large to be contained within the boundaries that others tried to impose upon them. The romance that blossomed between Sarah and Jake over the following weeks was like a desert flower blooming against all odds, beautiful and defiant in its very existence, thriving in conditions that should have been hostile to such delicate growth. They began meeting in secret, finding hidden places where they could talk freely, without the watchful eyes of the townspeople or the stern disapproval of Sheriff McKenna, who had made his feelings about his daughter's interest in the mysterious stranger abundantly clear during several heated discussions that had left both father and daughter frustrated and hurt. Their favorite meeting place became an abandoned mining claim about 2 miles north of town, where the skeletal remains of an old cabin provided shelter from both the elements and prying eyes, and the surrounding rocks and scrub brush offered privacy from anyone who might happen to be traveling the seldom-used trail that led deeper into the desert. The mining claim had been worked briefly during the silver boom of the late 70s, but when the vein played out, the miners had moved on to more promising prospects, leaving behind only the weathered timbers of their cabin and scattered pieces of equipment that were slowly being reclaimed by the desert. It was there, among the weathered timbers and scattered mining equipment, that told the story of dreams pursued and abandoned, that Sarah began to truly understand the man behind the mysterious reputation that seemed to follow Jake like a shadow. The cabin, though partially collapsed, still provided enough shelter for them to sit comfortably during their clandestine meetings, and Jake had taken the time to clear away the worst of the debris and even bring a couple of old blankets to make their hideaway more comfortable. It was a gesture that spoke to his consideration for her comfort, even in such rustic surroundings, and Sarah found herself touched by the thoughtfulness that he tried to hide beneath his gruff exterior. During their long conversations in that secluded place, Jake told her about his childhood in Texas, about the ranch his family had owned and operated for 3 generations before corrupt officials and unscrupulous land grabbers had conspired to steal it through a combination of legal manipulation and outright intimidation. He spoke of watching his father age 10 years in the space of 6 months as they fought a losing battle against forces that had more money and fewer scruples than a simple ranching family could hope to match. The loss of the ranch had broken his father's spirit and hastened his mother's death, leaving Jake alone in the world with nothing but his horse, his guns, and a burning desire for justice that had gradually transformed into something darker and more dangerous. "I never wanted this life, Sarah," he confessed one evening as they sat, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the colors so vivid they seemed almost unreal, like something from a fever dream or an artist's imagination. But sometimes a man finds himself in situations where all the choices are bad ones, and he has to pick the one he can live with, even if he can't live with himself afterward. His voice carried a weight of regret that made Sarah's heart ache for the pain he had endured, for the innocence he had lost, and the dreams that had been stolen from him, along with his family's land. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a life lived on the edge of survival, of countless hours spent working with rope and leather and steel, of fights won and lost, and the prices paid for both victory and defeat. "We all make choices, Jake," she said softly, her fingers tracing the lines on his palm as if she could read his future there, or perhaps rewrite his past. "What matters is what we choose to do next, how we decide to move forward from where we are right now." Their conversations ranged from the philosophical to the practical, from dreams of the future to painful memories of the past that shaped who they had become. Jake spoke of places he had seen in his travels, of mountains that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky, and rivers that ran so clear you could see the bottom even in the deepest pools, of cities where a man could walk for hours without seeing the same face twice, and where the past was just another country that no one cared to visit. Sarah shared her own dreams of adventure and independence, of proving that a woman could be more than just a decoration in a man's life or a prize to be won and displayed, that she could be a partner in every sense of the word, someone who could stand beside a man as an equal rather than walking behind him as a shadow. She spoke of her frustration with the limitations that society placed on women, the expectations that she should be content with a life of domestic duties and social obligations, never mind that her mind craved stimulation and her spirit yearned for experiences that lay far beyond the boundaries of what was considered proper for a lady. The physical attraction between them was undeniable, a magnetic pull that seemed to intensify with every stolen moment they spent together, every accidental touch that sent electricity racing through their veins like wildfire across dry grass. When Jake finally kissed her for the first time, it was under a canopy of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, each one a witness to the moment when two lonely souls finally found their match in each other. The kiss was everything Sarah had imagined and more, filled with passion and tenderness, with the promise of adventures yet to come, and the bittersweet knowledge that their love existed in defiance of everything their world considered proper and safe. It was a kiss that spoke of desperate longing and careful restraint, of a man who wanted nothing more than to lose himself in the woman he loved, but who understood the consequences that such abandon might bring. As the weeks passed, their secret meetings became the highlight of Sarah's existence, the bright spots of joy and excitement that made the mundane routines of small-town life not just bearable, but almost irrelevant. She found herself living for those stolen hours when she could be completely herself, when she could speak her mind without fear of judgment and dream aloud without being told that such dreams were inappropriate for a woman of her station. With Jake, she felt truly alive for the first time in her life, as if she had been sleepwalking through her days until he arrived to wake her up and show her what it meant to be fully present in each moment. Everything changed on the day the federal marshals rode into Copper Ridge, their badges glinting in the harsh sunlight like small suns, and their faces set with the grim determination of men on an official mission that would brook no interference or delay. Sarah was helping her father inventory supplies in the store, a tedious but necessary task that involved counting every bag of flour, every can of peaches, every bolt of fabric to ensure that their records matched their actual stock. When the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. The sound was different from the usual traffic that passed through their town, more urgent and purposeful, carrying with it an undertone of authority that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. Through the dusty window of the store, she watched as 4 men in dark coats dismounted in front of the sheriff's office with the synchronized precision of soldiers or lawmen who had worked together long enough to move as a single unit. Their horses were lathered with sweat and dust, evidence of hard riding over considerable distance, and the men themselves had the weathered, no-nonsense appearance of federal officers who had seen enough of the frontier's violence to approach every situation with maximum caution and minimum trust. The lead marshal, a tall man with graying temples and eyes like chips of flint that seemed to miss nothing as they swept over the town's main street, strode directly to where Sheriff McKenna was emerging from his office, clearly having heard their arrival and recognized the sound of official business approaching his jurisdiction. The marshal's coat was well-tailored but practical, designed for hard wear rather than fashion, and the gun at his hip rode in a holster that showed the smooth wear of frequent use. His companions spread out slightly, taking positions that would allow them to watch all approaches while their leader conducted his business. A tactical deployment that spoke of men who had learned not to take chances when dealing with dangerous fugitives. "Sheriff McKenna," the marshal said, his voice carrying clearly across the street, despite the early morning bustle of townspeople beginning their daily routines. "I'm Marshal William Hayes, and we're here on federal business that requires your immediate cooperation." He paused to remove an official-looking document from his coat pocket, unfolding it with the careful precision of a man who understood the weight that such papers carried in the territories. "We have reason to believe that Jake Thornfield, wanted for bank robbery and murder in 3 territories, is currently residing in your town and has been here for approximately 3 weeks. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the words hit her like physical blows, each syllable landing with the force of a hammer strike against her heart. Bank robbery, murder. The man she loved, the man who had shown her nothing but gentleness and respect, the man who spoke poetry in the moonlight and treated her as if she were made of spun gold and starlight, was wanted for crimes that could see him hanged from the nearest tree if he was taken alive, or shot down in the street if he resisted arrest. She watched in growing horror as her father's expression hardened, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the butt of his Colt revolver, the same gun that had kept the peace in Copper Ridge for the past 8 years and had never failed him when trouble came calling. The transformation in Sheriff McKenna was immediate and complete, the loving father disappearing behind the mask of the lawman who had sworn an oath to uphold justice regardless of personal cost. "Thornfield's been staying at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house," Sheriff McKenna replied, his voice tight with the conflict between professional duty and personal concern for his daughter's obvious attachment to the man in question. "But Marshal, I have to tell you, he's been nothing but peaceful since he arrived. No trouble at all, pays his bills on time, keeps to himself mostly. Hard to believe he's the same man you're describing." Marshal Hayes's expression remained unmoved by this character reference, his face showing the skeptical neutrality of a man who had heard similar testimonials about dangerous criminals too many times to be swayed by surface appearances. "That may be, Sheriff, and I appreciate your assessment of his behavior while he's been in your town," the marshal said, his tone respectful but firm. "But the man we're after is responsible for the deaths of 2 bank guards in Colorado Springs and a sheriff's deputy in Las Cruces, New Mexico. He's considered extremely dangerous and is to be taken alive if possible, dead if necessary. We have warrants signed by federal judges in 3 territories, and we intend to serve them today." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Sarah felt her world tilting on its axis, as if the very foundations of reality had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. She had to warn Jake, had to give him a chance to escape before the marshals could close their net around him like hunters surrounding a wounded animal. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct and the desperate need to protect the man she loved, she slipped out the back door of the store and ran through the maze of alleyways that connected the buildings behind Main Street, her heart pounding with fear and desperation as she tried to reach the boarding house before it was too late. The alleyways were narrow and cluttered with the detritus of small-town life, barrels and crates and discarded equipment that forced her to navigate carefully, even as urgency drove her forward. She could hear the voices of the marshals behind her, discussing strategy and positioning with the calm efficiency of men who had done this many times before, and she knew that time was running out with each passing second. She found Jake in his room on the second floor of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, calmly packing his few belongings into his saddlebags as if he had been expecting this moment all along, as if he possessed some sixth sense that warned him when danger was approaching, and it was time to move on to the next town, the next temporary refuge in his endless flight from a past that refused to stay buried. His movements were methodical and unhurried, each item placed with the careful consideration of a man who had learned to travel light and leave no trace of his passage. "You know," she said breathlessly as she burst through his door. And it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact that hung between them like an accusation or perhaps an absolution. Jake looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams since the first moment she saw him, and she saw in them a sadness that cut her to the bone, a weariness that spoke of years spent running from shadows that never seemed to grow any smaller, no matter how far or how fast he traveled. "I've been running for 3 years, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of those endless months of looking over his shoulder and sleeping with one eye open. "I always know when it's time to move on, when the past has finally caught up with the present, and there's nothing left to do but run again." The revelation that he had been preparing to leave without saying goodbye hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt tears burning behind her eyes as she realized that she had been living in a fool's paradise, believing that their love could somehow transcend the harsh realities of his situation. Sarah's world crumbled and rebuilt itself in the space of a heartbeat as she stood in that small boarding house room, watching the man she loved prepare to disappear from her life forever, like smoke dissipating in the desert wind. The sound of boots on the wooden stairs outside told them both that time was running out faster than sand through an hourglass. But Sarah McKenna had not inherited her father's stubborn streak and her mother's fierce determination for nothing. The blood of pioneers and survivors flowed through her veins, the legacy of people who had crossed an entire continent in search of something better and had carved a life out of the unforgiving wilderness through sheer force of will and refusal to accept defeat. "Take me with you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, before her rational mind could interfere with the desperate certainty that had taken hold of her heart. "Jake, please, I'm begging you, take me with you." The plea hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, and Sarah held her breath as she waited for his response, knowing that her entire future hung in the balance of his next words. Jake's hands stilled on his saddlebags, and when he looked at her, his expression was a mixture of longing and anguish that tore at her heart like claws ripping through silk. She could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the battle between his desire to protect her and his desperate need for companionship, between his love for her and his knowledge of the harsh realities that awaited anyone who chose to share his fugitive existence. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're asking," he said, his voice rough with emotion that he was struggling to control. "The life I lead, it's no life for someone like you. someone who deserves better than always running, always looking over your shoulder, never knowing if today's the day they finally catch up with you. It's sleeping on the ground more often than in a bed, eating whatever you can find or catch, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. It's a life of constant danger and uncertainty, where a single mistake can mean the difference between freedom and a hangman's noose. But Sarah stepped closer, her green eyes blazing with the determination that would have made her pioneer ancestors proud, the same fierce resolve that had driven them across the plains and through the mountains in search of a better life. "I understand perfectly," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I understand that I've spent 22 years in this town, feeling like I was slowly suffocating. Like I was meant for something more than measuring out flour and sugar and pretending to be interested in Harold Pemberton's marriage proposals and his endless discussions about bank interest rates and property investments. You make me feel alive, Jake Thornfield. More alive than I've ever felt in my entire life. And I'd rather spend 1 year truly living with you than 50 years merely existing without you." The sound of Marshall Hayes' voice drifted up from the street below, coordinating with her father about surrounding the building and cutting off all possible escape routes, the professional efficiency of lawmen who had done this dance many times before and knew all the steps by heart. Jake moved to the window with the fluid grace of a predator, his practiced eye assessing escape routes and calculating odds with the efficiency of a man who had survived by making such calculations quickly and accurately under pressure. The boarding house was 2 stories tall, with a steep roof and narrow alleyways on either side, surrounded by other buildings that could provide either cover or obstacles, depending on how the situation developed. "There's a back staircase that leads down to the alley behind the kitchen," he murmured, more to himself than to her, his mind already working through the possibilities and probabilities of various escape scenarios. "If I can make it to the stable without being seen, I might be able to get to my horse and ride out before they can organize a proper pursuit." Sarah corrected firmly, her voice cutting through his planning like a knife through butter. "If we can make it to the stable. I meant what I said, Jake. I'm going with you, whether you like it or not." Jake turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw the exact moment when his resolve cracked, when the lonely outlaw who had been running alone for so long finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the uncertain future by himself. It was a moment of surrender and acceptance, of a man who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, finally allowing someone else to help bear the load. "Sarah," he said, reaching out to cup her face in his hands, with a gentleness that belied the calluses and scars that marked them as the hands of a man who had lived by violence when necessary. "If you come with me, there's no going back. Your father, your life here, everything you've known and everyone you've loved, it'll all be gone forever. You'll be branded as an outlaw's woman, wanted by the law just for being with me. Are you really prepared for that? Are you ready to give up everything you've ever known for a life of uncertainty and danger?" Sarah covered his hands with her own, feeling the strength and gentleness in his touch, the contradiction that seemed to define everything about this complex man who had stolen her heart so completely. "My life here was never really mine anyway," she said softly, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even her with its certainty. "It was the life everyone else expected me to live. the role they wanted me to play in their carefully ordered world. But with you, I can finally live the life I choose, the life I was meant to live. I'd rather be an outlaw's woman who's truly alive than a respectable lady who's slowly dying inside. The decision was made in that moment, sealed with a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope in equal measure, of goodbye and hello, of endings and beginnings all wrapped up in a single moment of perfect understanding. Together, they gathered what few possessions Sarah could carry, the practical items that would be necessary for life on the trail, leaving behind the pretty dresses and delicate things that had no place in the harsh world they were about to enter. Jake helped her climb out the back window onto the slanted roof of the adjacent building, his strong hands steadying her as she navigated the treacherous footing in her long skirts. And together, they made their way across the rooftops like shadows fleeing the dawn. The escape that followed was like something out of the dime novels Sarah had read in secret, hidden away in her room where her father couldn't disapprove of such frivolous entertainment, full of heart-stopping moments and narrow escapes that would have been thrilling if the stakes hadn't been so terrifyingly real. They dropped down into the alley behind the milliner's shop, pressed themselves against the wall as a marshal walked past the mouth of the alley, not 20 feet away, and then ran in a crouching sprint toward the livery stable where Jake's black stallion waited, with the patience of an animal that had learned to be ready for sudden departures. They made it to the stable just as the marshals were breaking down the door to Jake's room, the sound of splintering wood echoing across the town like a gunshot. And within minutes, they were riding hard toward the desert. Sarah, clinging to Jake's waist as his powerful horse carried them away from everything she had ever known, toward an uncertain but chosen future that stretched out before them like an unwritten book, waiting for their story to fill its pages. Behind them, Copper Ridge grew smaller and smaller until it was just another speck in the vast expanse of the American frontier. And ahead of them lay the promise of freedom and the chance to build a life together on their own terms, far from the judgments and expectations of a world that had never understood either of them. As they rode through the night with the stars as their only witnesses and the desert wind as their blessing, Sarah felt truly alive for the first time in her life, her heart soaring with the knowledge that she had chosen love over safety, adventure over convention, passion over propriety, and that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the man who had awakened her soul to all the possibilities the world had to offer, to those brave enough to reach out and seize them.